Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. We will be starting in 60 seconds.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blue Prism Cafe. I'm Shail Chiara, the Chief Marketing and Customer Experience Officer here at Blue Prism. Blue Prism Cafe, as many of you know, is an engaging, thought-provoking webinar series on intelligent automation and the future of work. And I'm very excited to share with you that this is our 12th cafe today. It's 1 year in our journey since we launched the Blue Prism Cafe, and we've had very exciting speakers as we do today. We're joined by Lee Coulter and Scott Teeple. Lee is the CEO of Ascension Ministry Service Center. He's an expert in outsourcing strategy and organizational transformation. Lee currently leads the shared services operation of the largest nonprofit healthcare system in the U.S., bringing with him more than 30 years of experience in leadership roles in companies like GE, Aon, Kraft Foods. He also serves on numerous boards and advisory committees for organizations such as HFS Research, the SSON Group, the Shared Services and Outsourcing Network, the World ITO and BPO Forum, and the Frontier Strategy Group. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you, Shail.
And Scott is joining us as the CTO of Agilify. Scott Teeple is responsible for the automation strategies for Agilify Automation. His focus has been on operational excellence, solutions delivery, service delivery of RPA, RDA, and cognitive practice. His teams lead continuous improvement, intelligent automation, and augmented intelligence initiatives for large-scale organizations. Glad to have you here, Scott.
Thanks for having me, Shail. Thank you.
So I thought it might be worthwhile for us to do a quick introduction on the two companies, Ascension and Agilify. Lee, would you like to go first and share a little bit about Ascension?
Sure. Ascension is the world's largest not-for-profit health system with an 800-year legacy. Represents about 3% of the healthcare delivery capability in the United States, with 140 hospitals, 156,000 associates, and 3,000 sites of care in 22 states and the district. With a deeply held mission, caring for those most poor and vulnerable among us.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Clearly a very large operation, 140 hospitals. You heard 156,000 associations, 22 states. And we'd love to, get deeper into how a large organization like this uses automation and drives efficiencies within the organization. Scott, would you take a moment and tell us about Agilify?
Yeah, so Agilify, although it being new to the industry, we've been delivering the automation practice for Lee and Ascension now for 5+ years. Blue Prism's first North America client. So we've got quite an expertise around the delivery from the Center of Excellence to the Digital Workforce Management Suite. We've decided through our expertise and practitioner to take kind of this on the road and sell this to others who could benefit from our knowledge.
Thank you, Scott. That's very interesting. We have, as we speak to many customers in the cafe, outside of the cafe, there's always an interesting story around how RPA originates in their organization. There's sort of that spark that kicks off automation and RPA in the organization. How did the idea originate within Extension?
Yeah, there is a story, absolutely. And I guess it's worth sharing, Shale, that I ran global IT for Aon and I ran global IT for Kraft as the chief administrative officer. And so high level of affinity, my wife would call me a geek with personality, to technology. And so as we began standing up this center, and my experience with automation actually goes back to before enterprise automation was capable. We had developed a robot for tax recoupment when I was running the F&A centers back in the 90s. So we took a look at, you kept hearing about this thing, automation and RPA, coming out in around 2011. And so in 2012, I asked the team to take a look at what this really was, what was going on, and, was there something there? And I guess, the good news was the CEO didn't ask for a business case to convince the CEO to do what he wanted to do with automation. So I didn't require myself to prepare a business case to convince myself that this is where we needed to go. And we kind of snuck it in the back door. This is not something I necessarily recommend to everybody. But it was a little bit of the wild, wild west back there, Shale. And we ended up with a couple of rooms in our building with 40 machines running Blue Prism pretty quickly. Before IT really got wind of it, and we brought them kind of on the inside, and they actually threatened to turn all my machines off, and I said, that's fine, but you'll just need to call my boss and tell me that, and tell him that we need to hire 60 people to cover the work of the bots that we had in production at that point in time. So I think we've come a long way since then. We certainly understand kind of the best practices for bringing automation, into an enterprise in particular, but it was really a matter of really proving the value and getting experience without what we thought would be probably a 2-year to 3-year uphill climb with something so new as automation back in 2012 and 2013 to bring the organization along. So we wanted to prove it first. And kind of make it a fait accompli that we would be automating.
That's a fantastic story, Lee. Could you add to that in terms of your involvement? I should have mentioned this earlier in setting standards for RPA with IEEE. Give us a little bit of a glimpse in that, if you don't mind, and story behind it.
Yeah. This is a great story behind that, and in fact, I just left one of the IEEE working group meetings to come here to join you today as we're working on our second standard. So this was very much, even though people think that RPA is brand new, all of you, right, would tell the story of 2003 and 2005 when these tools and the development on them really, really began. But for all the world's view, it looked like stuff was just, landing on the world stage, coming out of nowhere. I think Pat Geary called, Blue Prism a 15-year startup. And it was interesting. If I went and talked to the Automation Anywhere team, they were using words and terms and describing, what their stuff did, and all of the different providers, Blue Prism, we were all confusing the marketplace in an extraordinary fashion. And we really didn't have a framework that allowed us to communicate and collaborate. And it was really frustrating. And I had approached Alistair, your CEO, and Mihir, and a number of other senior folks in the automation space. And I said, listen, we're all doing a disservice to this place called intelligent automation. And would you all be interested in developing some standards? And that resulted in a year-long pursuit and journey with the IEEE, finally in an unusual move where the IEEE Board of Governors actually took their reserve powers to directly sponsor a standards initiative that would impact many of their 43 societies. We've been doing this for about 2.5 years. 2755 was published in 2017, which really established the terminology, which allowed us to talk to one another in a way that was comprehensive. And we now use, as an example, intelligent automation as kind of the overall moniker for this space, with RPA being distinct, and we know what that is and how it's different from other automation products. The next standard will establish a taxonomy for about 165 features and functions across automation platforms and technology, which I think are going to make the world accelerate in their ability to understand what this technology can do, how to bring it in, and how to put it to effective use in the enterprise.
That's very helpful, Lee, and appreciate the effort that you're driving there, because there is a milkshake of lingua franca in this marketplace that's causing some level of hype and confusion around what is true enterprise RPA versus desktop applications. Since we're on a roll with stories, tell us, how did Agilify come to spin off from this journey?
So that's another great question and a great story, Shale. We realized that this automation thing was literally new. And what I mean by that is it wasn't IT and it wasn't business. And it really occupied this space. Dr. Mary Lassity, in her book, called it ultralight IT. I call it digital labor. Regardless of what name you put on it, it's a new thing. And so as we began to look at what it was going to take to really make this an enterprise program, we began to accrete groups. So we had our technology team, and we added that to our automation team, and then we took our CI team and we added them, and we took our analytics team and we added them. And when you look at this, Shale, it really, all of these groups had the same objective, which is to make the world better, right? To improve process, to take out cost, to reduce risk, error, improve quality, etc. And what we realized was that all of these groups needed to have an understanding of the tools that were being used by each other. And we needed to come together as a group to look at our processes, determine and develop some science around how much do we improve the process before we automate it, to have our CI people understanding how automation works and be looking for opportunities for automation, and conversely our automation folks to understand how CI works and when things should be improved or standardized before automated. And we started talking quite a bit about our successes with automation in various forums around the world. And there was one group in particular that approached me for the 4th time. They wanted to bring their leadership team on site, and they really wanted to understand this automation thing. And I said, listen, this would be, the 5th time, and there's only so much I can do for you just by sharing, leader to leader conversations about strategy, approach, tactics, measurements, etc. I said, well, what you really need is for me to send a couple of guys from my shop to your shop, but I can't do that for free. He said, done. Send me an SOW, and that was 2.5 years ago. And we realized then that what we were capable of doing and the depth of experience through COE development and change management and IT change management, business change management, how to scale, how to yield, how to establish productive relationships with audit and IT, all of these things that we had learned to do were in demand. And so I approached the holding company and said, I think we might have a business on our hands. And shortening that story, we received approval to test that hypothesis. It was tested successfully. December of last year, we launched Agilify, and in April of this year, it became a standalone business. And we're very excited to be able to offer what really amounts to almost 7 years of experience organizationally, technologically, and as a practitioner, moving all the way up through into probabilistic systems. Our first cognitive solution went into production on tax day this year at Ascension, the first Ascension. And we now embrace a whole suite of automation capabilities and have made that available through Agilify to others.
Yeah, it's very exciting, Lee, to see the adoption of automation within Ascension and to hear your story on Agilify. There are questions coming in around examples of processes that you have automated. Before we go to that, let's take a quick poll here just to understand where everyone is on their RPA journey. So if we can pull up the poll and have the audience vote on it, that would be excellent. So the question is, where are you on your RPA journey? And the choices are you haven't started, or you're just starting, or you've started recently under a year ago, or you've been on a journey for over a year. We'll give it another 30 seconds, and then I'll share with you the results here. While we're waiting, Lee or Scott, where do you think people are going to be in terms of just started recently under a year, or have been in a journey for over a year?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it'll be interesting to see where it shakes out.
Yeah. Where would the highest percentage be?
Yeah, I'm really thinking that we're going to be at that starting point and proof of value. I'd really like us to start moving into that under a year where we've started, but I just don't think that's where we're going to be.
Yeah, it's interesting, Shale. There's still whole industries that haven't even learned to spell RPA. I was commenting on this when we were doing some analysis on the adoption curve, and the conclusion was that we're on the leading edge of the early adopters, or the early majority, excuse me. And there's a lot of folks out there that are just getting started.
Yeah, and we really want to focus on kind of the overall journey, right, and the life cycle of how individuals come into it. And with all of our kind of initial engagements, we're still finding individuals still just trying to figure out what is this thing, what is it really about, and really helping individuals through not only the education of what it can do, but why you really want to make a real investment into the space.
Absolutely, and the results are in, and here's what they look like. Wow. Right? 36% said they've been on a journey for over a year. 19% have started recently, just under a year, and then it's a close tie between 23%. We're only just starting, proof of concept, to 21% saying haven't started. Are you surprised, gentlemen?
No, I think it's a good makeup, and I'm excited to see that 44% of folks are getting started and embracing engaging with best practices and those who have come before. Something that I want to make sure, there's two things that I talk about. One of them is that RPA is a gateway to digital transformation. And for everybody who's told to go do some digital transformation, this is that. And it is transformative. This is as transformative as ERP was in the 90s. It literally changes your organization and sets you on a direction to digital transformation. And so for folks to recognize that they need to go and hear from those who have come before, and not make the painful mistakes that many of us have made on our journey, that's just fantastic. Still you there?
Yeah, I mean, I think these numbers are very, very interesting. Some of the questions that are coming in are around examples of processes that have been automated. So, can you give us some examples of which processes? How did you identify them? What kind of results have they generated?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and we're literally talking hundreds of use cases over these many years. Our early use cases focused on swivel seat, and we focused in talent acquisition and in leave management, where a tremendous amount of swivel seat activity was occurring as people needed to get information from one system into another in a slightly transformed way. We've become far more sophisticated in the use cases that we're pursuing today. Scott, maybe you can give a couple of examples of some of our more dramatic use cases.
Yeah, so recently, Lee, you talked about our recent cognitive use case that we put in place, but where that really started was, around a fixed asset use case where the capital expenditure was coming in and it was taking 10, 15 minutes to just do the analysis around what was coming in and should it have been capitalized, should it not been. It was really clunky, and we were spending a lot of time and trying to just digest what it was that was coming into the system, and putting a system in place with using a couple of different tools actually in place with RPA, RDA, and the cognitive has really brought us to quite a total yield, as we kind of talk about total yield instead of just an ROI.
Yeah, this is a great example, Shale, in fact, because here Agilify has developed a proprietary process and technology stack called Rodilo, which allows us to bring design thinking in with automation and allows us to totally transform a role. If you look at the way work is done and the work that is actually done, it is completely different from where we started, and that was deployed in 12 weeks. I should also mention that we converted to Agile a couple of years ago, which has been an enormous boon to the program in total.
So Scott, you mentioned total yield, and I've heard Lee, you mentioned that a couple of times as well. And it might be, I understand what it is. It might be worthwhile just taking a few seconds to share what do you mean by that with the audience.
Yeah, I'll open it up and I'll hand it to Scott because the challenge was really handed to Agilify. And the question came up, you guys are using all kinds of people. Now you've got multiple technologies, you've got infrastructure, you've got production management teams. And the question came up really, what is the total program yield from all of this work? And so we set ourselves a goal, and when I say it that way, it was audited by internal audit. So we actually developed a methodology to A, capture your starting point, and B, capture your end point in a way that is comprehensive to the extent that it captures your total program yield. And this is a question we think that more and more businesses are going to be asking their automation teams as they become more pervasive, is really, how do you know that this is providing a net benefit to the enterprise? And we've been able to demonstrate in terms of our total cost to deliver between 10 and 14% cost reduction year on year for 5 years in a row. And we're going to do that again this year. And how are we doing that? Well, our automation program is key to that. So we had proof points, but then we set a challenge for ourselves. And Scott, maybe you can say more about how you actually rose to that challenge.
Yeah, and before I get into that, in the early days of our RPA program, we were really just focused on the R. We were, the return on investment. We were really trying to figure out, how do we pay for this? How do we really put a program in place that was going to not
kind of on a use case basis?
Yeah, and it wasn't putting a burden on the overall cost, right? And that was really the focus, and we were really looking for those automations that were really going to be those big bang bucks, right? That was just going to really bring it back. But it was over time, those really went away. In our program, we were really searching to say, okay, how do we keep the momentum going? And that's when, I think you approached us in this concept of audit, right? When you talk about, okay, how am I actually looking at my organization and saying, how do I replace some of the things that are going on when I look at audit, or when I look at quality, when I look at customer experience, when we looked at our contact center and we were talking about how the overall experience for our associates and our external customers and how those automations were impacting. We had to stop and we had to look and say, hey, there's more here than just the ROI on the return, right?
Yeah.
It's not about dollar.
Well, there's dollars for sure, right?
Yeah.
I always encourage people to harvest tasks. So we have hardcore measurements around that. But as Scott's talking about this, our smart controls transformation using automation, we literally took humans out of the equation in control steps with our partners in audit, our auditors, and we moved 8 key controls in a year. So reducing the risk profile to Ascension, how do we value that? We increased customer satisfaction, if you can believe this, in 13 months by 17%. So how do you quantify the total program yield?
17%, did you say? Wow.
17%. And so when we talk about automation for experience or for CX, and as Scott was saying, in the beginning, it was about harvesting tasks, and that is absolutely something you should start and never stop doing, right? But when you can now do strategic automation, when we published one of our strategic automations was to give our vendors the ability to reconcile their accounts receivable with us 24 hours a day in an automated fashion. So we now have published externally a piece of automation that our vendors can use. So what is it worth to give your vendors 24-hour access to do an entire AR reconciliation batch in 3 minutes? These are some of the things that we've moved into use cases that, sure, they save us time and labor and money, but they also change the game strategically. And that's really, making that transition from just automating the things that people were doing to using automation to do things that you haven't yet imagined. It's been a transformation.
Yeah, and if I can just weigh in here, and you say, for the IT purist out there, you would say, yeah, we can do that, right? Just give me some .NET or give me some Javas, and in a year and a half, I'd have you a product, and it would be great. And the reality is through this automation program, we're able to do these things in months or weeks, if not months. So there is this transformation in how we're able to deliver in a totally different fashion and not bring in an inherent risk in the way that we're delivering. There's no additional quality systems that have to be put in place because we're using the system of records.
Yeah, and one thing
go ahead, Lee.
I was just going to add one other thing, which is we had predicted that a bot would show up in an audit finding, and we had set for ourselves a goal that we kind of knew the minute that happened that the auditors would say, well, now I need to audit your whole automation program and see whether or not you've got appropriate segregation of duties. Do you have appropriate highly available infrastructure? Do you have a BCP plan? How do you do detection, monitoring, and management of production automation, and yada, yada, yada. So we actually, several years ago, self-initiated on ourselves with a consult partner, a SOC 2 audit of Agilify, for the very purposes of being ready when the question got asked, so tell me about how well run your automation program is. So Agilify has years of experience of being through a SOC 2 audit to be able to rise to the challenge of being able to prove that production automation is enterprise class.
Yeah, and I just want to throw a little spot in there around the design authority and what we were able to accomplish within that audit because of adopting some of the design authority recommendations from Blue Prism to say, hey, we have a really strong program, and here's the documentation that actually goes through and supports, like any software development lifecycle would. It was really critical to our success.
And Shale, you asked the question about scale and yield. What I'm trying to share here are things that through your journey you will tackle on your way to enterprise scale and total program yield. You will end up putting automation in processes that are involved in compliance or regulatory processes. You just will. And so knowing that in advance, knowing how to structure your program such that you can withstand that level of scrutiny and diligence by your auditors, that's part of reaching scale.
Yeah, look, Lee and Scott, I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. In order to achieve scale, in order to achieve, the returns that we're talking about on an ongoing basis at scale, that question that you posed, tell me how well your automation is run, is critically important to answer. So I'm glad you addressed some of the aspects of what it takes to have a scalable enterprise solution. But the one thing that you mentioned earlier also about automating, using automation to do things that you could have imagined. It seems to me that an organization's imagination is really the limiting factor in terms of how far they can go with RPA. And of course, obviously picking the right tool to do that. Would you say that would you agree with that statement?
I would, and there's kind of a natural evolution, and it can be provoked, but for us it was a natural evolution as we began to realize that you could hire digital labor, which is the way I talk about automation, to do the work that people are already doing, but you can also hire digital labor to do work that no human would or could ever do. And when you unwrap that box of possibility, Shale, it just changes the game. I'll share a use case that we've been engaged with, which was identifying in our clinical setting opioid diversion. And there are certain hallmarks from when the doctor's orders are submitted to when they're picked up, to when the pharmacy door or cabinet is open, to when the records are noted that the medication's been administered. There are certain things that are a hallmark of diversion. This is not something you could ever hire a human being to do, but I can hire digital labor to watch every one of these different systems, look for the trigger, and then begin to watch for the hallmarks of appropriate and inappropriate behavior. This is a great example of where we're using automation to do things that you could never have a human being do that kind of work.
Yeah, I think it leads to the conversations that we've had in the past, Lee, around the Lincoln logs or the box of possibilities.
Yep.
And being able to sit down and saying, in the typical IT procurement world, you've got a business plan or you got a business problem that is already laid out in front of you, and now you're going out and you're going to tackle it by finding a software tool that fits or solves that business problem.
Right.
And quite frankly, these tools are not that. When you start looking at all of their core capabilities and saying that you don't have to be classically trained anymore, you don't have to go to a 4-year school and understand, how software development lifecycle works, but truly understanding how widgets kind of get put together within a macro-based type, ease, really starts opening the doors for your subject matter experts to finally start being able to solve their own business problems in a scalable fashion, right? And instead of it, man, I just programmed it or I've just created it, now I got to support this thing, or I changed my job, right?
Yeah, and I want to address the 44% who are just getting started here. This is actually a term that I use, which is automation software is a box of possibility. The R in the ROI is undefined. It is entirely based on how the business uses it. And there's a common trap people fall into where in order to satisfy the typical IT and procurement requirements to have a business case, they look for a big old gnarly use case, which is not the right use case to do your proof of concept or proof of value on. What you need to do is come with a SAC or a list of 20 use cases that are all appropriate for automation, and just get over the line in terms of satisfying this old notion of a business case that results in the purchase of the platform. Blue Prism, when you take it out of the box, does not contain any business logic. There's nothing that's going to solve a business problem when you take it out of the box and install it. It is entirely dependent on the business to drive use case after use case after use case after use case. And that's really fundamentally different. And I just want to drive that point home for that 44% who are in the early stages.
Yeah, it is indeed different, and it also it's the business case application to it. It's also about the methodology that you use to deploy this, and that's why we have the robotic operating model, which has driven significant scale and success within organizations. But I think fundamentally, what I'm hearing you say is it's changing the equation in the organization, or the question in the organization, from it's impossible to what is possible. And, Lee, you had written about this recently, that, just the decision-making process is different as well. If you're trying to buy enterprise software versus if you're looking at an RPA solution.
Yeah, it really is.
Go ahead, Lee. Were you going to expand on that?
I'm just, this is one of those reasons why your robotic operating model is so important to folks, and to explain why this is different. IT and procurement have refined hammers, right? And they're used to hitting nails. And this is a rivet, and you can smash that rivet to bits with a hammer. And really understanding the fundamental difference between this and a typical piece of enterprise software acquisition is absolutely fundamental in getting yourself across to the point where you're ready to contemplate the robotic operating model and all that implies for real enterprise scaling.
So let's switch gears for a second. I think as I look at the market, broadly than automation, there's clearly some automation anxiety out there. But what's interesting, from my vantage point, I look at a lot of different technologies, and with 3D printers printing organs these days, and our average screen time is about 10 hours per day, our digital footprint is vastly greater than our physical footprint. Yet there is automation anxiety, fear of job loss, and how do you drive adoption, internal adoption and buy-in within your organization? Tell us a little bit about that. How did you see that? How did you handle that within Ascension?
It is another one of those important steps on the road to enterprise scale. And Scott will probably remember the conversation. We were several years in, and progress nearly ground to a halt. And I was really pushing on Agilify and assuming that we had a delivery problem and that they weren't delivering. And Scott, you might share your comments back to me when I kind of confronted you on that topic.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, when we were really struggling, it was getting individuals to show up to meetings. It was they had so many priorities that were out in front of them, and they really hadn't taken ownership and really understood exactly what was going on. And I remember explaining to you, Lee, you don't understand. We don't have the adoption that we think that we have. We're really struggling to get that buy-in, and a little bit of that associate experience model where they really didn't and weren't coming to the table and sharing not only the possibilities that were out in front of them themselves, but they weren't even willing to give us the information that was required to even do the automations.
Yeah, I didn't believe this, Shale. I really didn't. And Scott stood firm on it. And so what I decided to do was to kind of go find out for myself. So we have a CX team and a CX program and I pointed them at the organization. I said, let's go do some empathy mapping. And let's go understand what's happening. A digital native, a millennial, a Gen X, or a boomer, what is common, what's different to how they approach technology? We discovered some really interesting behavioral differences around the anxiety that this brought. And then it really became clear. Scott's point on adoption cannot be underscored. You know, a supervisor who, for however long they've been supervising people, their identity is based on how many people they manage, and their ability to understand that work is being done and be comfortable in their accountability for a certain work product is based on their ability to go talk to people. So this drives a couple of really important things that are you know, again, contributory to our ability to scale and yield. Is, well, you need an organizational change management plan, because at the end of the day, automation remains about people. I know that sounds silly, but it's about people. And you're expecting people to change the way that they work every 30, 60, 90 days as new automation is being deployed. Do you understand where their fear, uncertainty, and doubt is? You're asking supervisors to now be accountable for the same work product, but they have 4 human FTEs and 6 digital FTEs. How do you build automation in a way that gives them insight into the fact that work is in fact being produced, that they can feel comfortable remaining accountable for a work product in which more than half of it is not being performed by people that they can talk to? These are some of the learnings that went into us really conquering that stall point. And you'll hear more about, you know, stall points from me as we talk about scale, because it was a big stall point. The program really slowed down a lot, Shale, until we understood this automation anxiety and then developed appropriate communication, adoption plan, change management, and literally changed the way that we built automation to provide insight for management into the production of the work that they were accountable for. So just a ton of changes that were a really big deal.
Yeah, so some of those, just to give you some highlights of some of the change, you know, we moved from an isolated development team and brought the business into it from the subject matter experts and gave them a lot more ownership into how things were done. And quite frankly, they now named their robots, and they've become a personality within the development or within the business themselves. So really great transformation as we've seen over the last year.
Yeah, you know, I've often said that organizations are made up of 2 things. It's people and everything else. And it's the people in these organizations that drive the automations, the revenue, and the impact that the organization has. So with this particular stall point, as it relates to culture and culture adoption, I'm sure it varies from organization to organization. It also depends on the organizational DNA itself. But is there a silver bullet, or maybe there isn't one, that helps you drive that adoption within the organizations when it comes to the culture stall point?
It is a multi-threaded response that needs to be built into the program. You know, as Scott was talking about, some of the ingredients in that program are involvement of the actual delivery team in how stuff gets built. So literally having end users sit down in design teams, weighing in on where's the best process cut point, where do exception paths become too confused, what are the real business rules, despite what you think might be true. And so there's an involvement component. There's a conversation component management and leadership needs to have about the fear of job displacement. This is real, Shale. Now, I can tell you that we have not displaced a single human being doing this stuff for almost 7 years, not one. And in a survey of about 80 programs, that same thing was true. But nonetheless, people are human. And in the absence of an explicit conversation about what are your intentions here, people will make up their own story to fill that in. Same with supervisors and their identity and self-worth. I love your statement. There's people and then everything else. And it was a real surprise to us to find out that our automation program was more dependent on the people components than the technology components. The technology works. It's just that simple, right? This is enterprise automation platforms, and if you've been following the best practice instructions on how to bring that in, that's not your concern. This is really about people and culture. So there's no silver bullet. This is, we keep talking about the journey. And what we know is kind of where you are, we know where you're going to be, and the challenges that you're going to face, and the changes that you'll need to make in response to that. And it's interesting as well, you can't solve some of these problems. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go in, in your year one and you're trying to solve problems that you're going to encounter in year three, it's just not going to be very effective because people are going to be wondering, why are you saying this or doing that? We don't have those problems today. So understanding your journey as you scale from 1 to double digits, then to 50 plus, into triple digits, and when you really become enterprise scale, these things need to change. As an example, your automation program, when you have 5 bots out there, doesn't need to withstand a SOC 2 audit. But when you have 250 bots in production, guaranteed, that program will need to withstand an audit. And that's part of the journey of making enterprise scale and total yield.
Yeah, and one angle that we take, quite frankly, is that no customer or no company is the same. We talk about your digital transformation or even a center of excellence, and we say, when have you in your history ever been successful in driving a center of excellence or transformational change? And if the answer is you've never been, then it's not a one-size-fits-all. We're not going to bring a pre-described model and saying, oh, well, then just do this, it will work, right? There's a lessons learned, there's an understanding of your culture, what you have underneath
the whole toolbox.
Absolutely, and it's retrofitting, and it's working together and figuring out what works for you and your company, what's our best practice, and what do we know and what do we have. You marry the two together, and that's what lays out a plan. And it's not, hey, I just picked it off the shelf and I'm going to come out, and if you just do, this magic bullet, 16 items, you'll be successful.
It's their prototypical or archetypal folks that we know to deal with. We know that in certain industries, some things are emphasized, some things are not emphasized. In the BFSI vertical, there's a slightly different profile than if you're in energy or utilities. If you're in hospitality or entertainment, there are some things that are we can kind of predict, but I think Scott's point is right on, which is it's a whole toolkit with probably 10 or 12 major tools in it to get you past the automation anxiety stall point.
What are some of the other stall points that you see? What essentially is the secret to scaling? You've clearly done that at Extension and the work that you're doing now with Agilify to help Extension and possibly other organizations. But what is that secret to scaling?
Well, I'll give you 2 more of them, and I'll let Scott talk about them. So one was design authority, and I can't say enough about how critical that is. And the other is the production management support structure. And I'll tell you, both of those are super non-trivial. And Scott, maybe you can talk more about, because for you, each of those was a journey unto itself.
Yeah, so in the early days, and we had just a couple of developers, and we're really trying to figure this thing out and utilizing the Blue Prism objects that were available to us, but there wasn't any really coding standards. We didn't have an understanding of how we should be taking things in place, and 3 different developers all had different logins to our PeopleSoft system, and they were done differently. And as we were really working through it, and then we realized that as these automations that were in place were starting to go down, we had stopped our development process because we were actually spending more time trying to fix what we had put in place as we were learning. And we said, okay, this is not scalable. We're not going to be able to do this, right? Understanding software development lifecycle and what was actually successful for the last 30 to 40 years.
And when I say stall point, what Scott may or may not recruit into this conversation was the fact that we stopped the program for 9 months.
We literally stopped the program.
We stopped the program for 9 months.
Yeah.
That's how big a stall point this was.
Yeah, we really had to stop and say, we had to think about the design standards themselves and how
and documentation
and documentation and
documentation,
you know, and how code reusability and object you know, really fit into the overall ecosystem.
Even object nomenclature, Shale.
Yeah, and even down into the notes and how things are actually put into the objects themselves for code reusability. So and then the other stall point, right, was that how did we get into production, and you start getting into
all of a sudden we've got 10 people doing production management, and we realized we had to bifurcate production from development or configuration.
Yeah.
And then everybody's saying, well, this is totally different.
Yeah, how do I do code reviews? How do I understand what exactly you're giving me from a development perspective is actually what the business is asking for? And as I'm doing my code review, how do I know that it's actually something that I can support and take on as we do this DevOps handoff?
And when the business is angry with you because overnight automation didn't run, and the last person that remembers how to do that process manually left the building 2 years ago, operations is now completely reliant on your automation production management team that production occur, that automation occur. And this is you know, so the long story short is this is a sea change of how do you do production management when the business might have to make a call. Do I rerun the batch? Do I let it go? Do I restart it? You know, do I let it go for a day? Only the business can assess the right direction to go. So they're kind of like level 4 in a support structure that, you know, there's IT and infrastructure. There's IT and the target source systems and systems of record. Then there's the automation platform itself. Then there's the configured automation. And then finally, there's the business processes that are running dependent on that whole that pyramid that I just described. That you know, when you get into triple digits, you got to know how to solve it.
Yeah, and quite frankly, this is the lessons learned and the knowledge that we brought into our training academy for the Blue Prism product, and likely why we've been so successful in delivering that.
These stall points, you know, particularly this one is quite interesting. That made you realize a decision that caused a 9-month impact. You know, these stall points are very interesting, and they vary, I imagine, from organization to organization. Sounds like, you know, you guys were deep down into the production cycles to ensure that your output and your yield was maximized over time. And there are other companies, and even the 44% who mentioned on the earlier poll that they're just starting, there are other companies who want, you know, a quick way to get a single task automated. And, you know, they're looking at various different RDA desktop solutions that are out there that don't, you know, those organizations don't necessarily perhaps see the stall points that would come down the line. What recommendation would you have for organizations that are just starting off and using, you know, starting with RDA maybe?
One is have an advisor who's been there and done that. And I say that because today, when we entered these stall points, there was nobody to ask, Shale, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about design authority, you can now get that lesson, that learning, and you can actually even have somebody predict when you're going to need it, when you should build it, what are the best practices to have it and manage it, because you know that in the future when production management comes into question, they're going to rely on design authority to have ultimately supportable automation in production. So you know, the suggestion really is you know, get smarter, have a great advisory partner that has lived the journey.
Scott, any thoughts from your side? Would you agree with that? as well?
I 100% agree, and you know what we're seeing within the competitive landscape today is several organizations trying to get into their program and failing with a partner who doesn't necessarily understand, and they're trying to fit you in a box and just trying to get that $200,000 deal and not necessarily looking at the overall program, and they're asking us to help them just frankly get started on their own. The recommendation that Lee's giving is understand who you're getting advice from, and make sure that they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, Shale, I said there weren't a lot of people to ask, but David Brain and Pat Geary and a host of folks at Blue Prism were instrumental to us solving some of these problems early on. I said it before, if you haven't actually solved these problems for yourself, having a PowerPoint that says here's how to deal with automation anxiety, and the whole conversation we had about you've got 20 tools in your toolbox, and to know which 8 are going to be the right 8 for your situation. If you haven't had to do that yet before, then you might not pick the right 8, or you might try to apply all 20, or just take the 2 that work, for the last, piece of enterprise software that was put in.
Yeah, I mean, this is amazing, and we can continue on and on with this discussion. We have 2 minutes left, and I want to ask one question and just make one comment before I do that. Is that there are tons of questions coming in, including one person who's super excited about joining Agilify. So Scott, I'll connect up with you after this webinar. But there are tons of questions coming in, and I apologize we've run out of time, but we will definitely follow up with a blog. And before I turn it over to Charlotte to talk about logistics and next steps, one last question for you, Lee and Scott. What are the 1 or 2 things you want to leave the audience with? We've discussed quite a bit of exciting stuff here, stall points and yield and cultural adoption. What are the 1 or 2 things that you want the audience to leave with?
Really, I'll say it's a combo. This is transformational, and it is the gateway to digital transformation. This notion that you can kind of leapfrog and find yourself straight in more advanced digital spaces, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. And the other thing is that this is truly transformational. It does change the organization and how it works. Those were the 2 things I would, and it's worth the pursuit, I guess, is the last way I would cap that off.
Yeah, and I would just add to start small and choose a trusted advisor. It's critical.
Start small, absolutely.
Start small.
Very good. Gentlemen, this was very, very insightful, very helpful. Really appreciate you guys taking the time.
Thanks for having us, Shale.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to you, Charlotte.
Perfect. Thank you very much to everybody who is on the line, who joined in and asked all of those questions. So as mentioned by Shale, we'll be writing a follow-up blog. You can expect it on the Blue Prism website within the next couple of days. We'll probably actually do a second blog with all the questions that have been left unanswered with our friends from Ascension and Agilify on the phone today. So you will be receiving an email within the next hour or so with the recording of this. So make sure you share it with all your friends and colleagues. And as of now, already you can register to our next cafe, which will be about actual change management and managing change within the enterprise. So our customer, AGS, who's a insurance company in the UK, will be talking about tactical tips and tricks as to how they did it within the business to, really get some buy-in within the internal employees with the deployment of RPA. So finally, the last thing I'm going to suggest is after I've closed the webinar and closed the window, you'll be served a survey. If you could please give some feedback. I see some people have already shared some feedback. Please send it over. We are really creating these cafes for you. And obviously, if you want to hear a bit more about Agilify, there's also an opportunity for you to raise your hands to get to know a bit more about what Agilify are doing. So that is all for us. Thank you very much for your time today. We're bang on time and wish you all a very good day. Thank you again to Lee and Scott for this session. Thank you for emceeing this, Shale, and look forward to meeting you all next month. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.